How do you prepare to write about the horrors of war in Eastern Europe during World War II? Well, today's guest, Cindy Adams, had a creative and really smart answer to that dilemma, writing horror novels first. Cindy got her start in academia, where she is now a Professor Emerita at the University of Connecticut and a retired psychologist. After years in academia writing textbooks and journals, she transitioned to a different kind of writing, from a cookbook to horror novels and, of course, her latest book, The Red Toque, Love and Loss in the Time of Tito. Why is storytelling so important? What's it like transitioning from academia to historical fiction? And why is it best to write about something that you have a personal connection to? Cindy, Otis, and I dive into all this and much more in today's great episode. Quick reminder to rate, review, and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening. You can also find the full videos of the show on our YouTube page. And if you learned something from Cindy, Otis, or me in our conversation, make sure to share the episode with someone else so they can learn it too. The best way to support our show is to share your favorite episodes with the rest of your tribe. This episode is brought to you by Tribe and Purpose. That transition from college to that first career is a difficult one, and it's even harder when you lose your sense of identity. If you're an athlete who just hung up the cleats, it's hard to go from being a rugby player to being Joe in accounting. We created Next is Best to help retired college athletes to use their skills to create an impact through entrepreneurship. Next is Best by Know Your Tribe will help to smoothen that rough transition by helping you establish a clear sense of purpose, an actionable path to success, and the tools you need to manage your life. Your 20s are a confusing and chaotic time. Next is Best gives you the tools you need to make sense of the chaos and make this next chapter of your life the best one yet. You can learn more about Next is Best by Know Your Tribe at findyourpurpose.coach. Now here's Cam and Otis with the show.
Hey, welcome to the Cam and Otis Show. We're a father-son podcast where we talk with other lifelong learners about making an impact and solving big problems. And in this episode today, we've got a good friend of ours, and I might let you in on the secret of why she's a good friend now. Cindy Adams joining us, author, Professor Emeritus. I always have trouble with that word. Did I say that word right? Emeritus.
Oh,
what?
Emeritus.
Emeritus. Yeah, see it?
Right.
Starting off the show with big words and complicated names always gets me. Cindy, it's great to have you. And by the way, I just want to say thank you. We had some technical problems the other day, so we're coming back together for part 2 or retake 2 or retake 1. But now that I've rambled on long enough, I was looking back through my notes and looking back through your bio, and I thought this was really interesting. You spent your career basically, and I'll just call it that, as an academic and writing academic papers. And then you decided to write a novel. What happened? I mean, was it you just woke up one morning and said, I don't want to tell the truth anymore, I want to make something up? Or
Well, I'd always had that little evil in me that wanted to make up stories and get away with it, I guess. But I had been teaching, from a very young age, and then when I retired as early as I could, I guess, because I had been doing it for over 30 years, and it just seemed like time for a change. And I'd wanted to write novels, but never had the time. With a career, actually a double career, a family, it was only then that I finally had a chance to try it, just to see if I could do it. It was like a bucket list item. Can I write a novel? And it turned out I sort of could.
Sort of?
Well,
no,
I did it.
I'd say you did. You
a few times now.
Yeah, that's great. And your latest one, The Red Toque, Love and Loss in the Time of Tito. And yeah, I got it right. I thought I did. I thought I'd switched words around. What about that time and that era and quite frankly that geography of Slovenia, the Slovenian people and that whole area drew you into that story?
Well, the answer's a little bit long, but we have an hour, right?
Yes, ma'am. And I can take a drink of water. So thank you.
Sure. The very beginning of my life was because my parents had met during World War II. My mother was a little Italian girl not a child, that my father met, and he was a U.S. GI over in Italy. And I grew up knowing my mother was special. She was different, and she talked a little different, and she made great food, and we had all these cousins in Europe, and they talked about the war, and my father was very proud of his time in the service. In fact, for the rest of his life, most of his good stories started with when I was in the service, and then he'd tell the story. So I was very comfortable with that kind of a cultural split, if you will, dual culture. But then I got
Mm.
married, and my husband, coincidentally, had a mother who was a war bride as well. But she was from Yugoslavia, as we were told, but it turned out to be the part of Yugoslavia that is Slovenia. And because I knew my mother's story and my mother-in-law had told me a little about her story, I was foolish enough not to look more deeply. It wasn't until after we were adults, quite adults, um, that I decided I would like to know more about her country, but she was gone by then. Before I could ask very much. But she had left a lot of pictures with notes on them, and some of her family was still living. So I decided to find out more, and I realized that one of her brothers had disappeared in the war, and that all of her family had been disrupted. There were 6 Slovenian children who were just coming of age as the war broke out. They had finished school, they had got prepared for careers, or they were recently married and starting homes, and suddenly the Luftwaffe, or however you say that, were flying over the mountains at them, and Germany was taking over their country, and there were battles going on, and of course it all erupted into total chaos. So she had to flee, and her sisters and the brothers that stayed, one was in the service, and one stayed home to serve. But it was a very mysterious kind of happening. If you asked anyone in her family what had happened to this one brother, they would say he's missing, but they wouldn't say he was gone.
Mm.
Even now, his granddaughter won't say he's gone. It's very touching.
Wow. Do you think, and this will tap into your psychologist part of this, do you think there's a tie to the hope of all, that he will just show up one day, or do you think it's more of a they don't want to admit that he's
Well, I
gone?
think it's denial at some level, but his wife, they had just been married a short time. She was very beautiful. It was a very romantic kind of story, and they had one tiny little daughter. And as I
Mm.
mentioned throughout the book, I talk about their romance some. I talk about his promise to come back and her believing it, and how long she waited. In fact, she waited all her life for him to come home, so that her daughter was always thinking, well, maybe someday my father will show up. And that was kind of passed on to her children, who are living still, and they're young and they're vital, and they always refer though to their grandfather as missing. It's cultural, I guess.
Was there was there some connection that you had aside from your husband's family and the the blood connection to the area? But you talked about I think the way you put it was the dual culture of your family between your dad being a GI and your mom being from Italy. One of the things that the little bit of history I know is Eastern Europe is a cultural melting pot, hodgepodge, whatever you'd want to call it, just going back as far as you could of the different empires going through there and the different cultures mixing into that area. Was that part of the connection that you found to that region?
I didn't know it going in, but subsequently I have discovered, well, these are the things I knew. My mother-in-law and my mother were born about 500 miles apart in Eastern Europe and met in New Hampshire. Can you believe that? My mother came from my mother
Wow.
came from Rome, Italy, to Manchester, New Hampshire, which is where I was raised. And the culture shock must have been incredible. My mother-in-law was raised in a very agrarian culture. She worked on a farm as a child. She helped the family's farm. But when she fled, she went to London. So she was quite different in her young adulthood. She worked for Lord and Lady Wedgwood, in fact. They would the only ones who would hire her because the Slovenian accent to the untrained ear sounds very much like a German accent. And anywhere she went in to apply for a job, she and her sister, they would say, "Go away, we don't want anything to do with you." And they were, light-haired and blue-eyed, and so it was assumed they were trying to pass for something else, I guess. But it the similarity was there. Then I discovered that in the part of Italy that's usually in Italy called Trieste, which is right along the border there, many Yugoslavians, Slovenians especially, had fled over the years to get away from some of the poverty in their country. And they had changed their names either by being required to by the mayor, which was one aspect, or by desire to pass kind of into the culture. They had added an I to all their last names, or an A, and probably dropped the J's because a lot of the Slovenian names have J's in them that don't make a sound anyway. So, um, but I didn't know about all of that until later. Um, and the Italians were, part of the group that worked with the Germans to attack them, and it was terrible.
Mhm.
But there was never any animosity between my mother-in-law and my mother. They loved each other. It was just they neither one of them was political. They except that they were both very pro-America and always had been, and that's why my mother-in-law ran to England because she wanted to be with the Allies. She didn't want to have anything to do with those other forces. And my mother was just young and
Did that?
go ahead.
Oh, so I was just gonna say, did that cultural perspective of having the two family members from different sides of the war there, what I would think is it brings in that kind of the really human component of the war, which we miss so much, especially when we start talking World War II and we kind of use the broad strokes of the evil empire, the Nazis, and we kind of throw everyone into these buckets, whereas when you're a person in these countries, it's not, I don't hate Slovenia. It's more, this is what the country's doing and these type of things. Do you think that helped you to, I guess, sympathize with the antagonists of your story in
The
that kind of a way?
antagonists were the Germans and the communists, and I still don't like them. The Slovenians were not. The Slovenians were not with Hitler. They were fighting Hitler the whole time. They just had to go through a lot to get out of that, and eventually, uh, you know, they were conquered. The partisans helped to conquer the Nazis, and they, at the end of the war, were given to Tito, who then ran it as a communist country, and that was a problem too. But the Slovenians were very sympathetic to the Allies. In fact, the reason they erupted into war when they did in let's see, in about 46, I think I wrote it down somewhere anyway. There, they had a 17-year-old who was king, but he had a regent who was running the country for him, a regent named Paul, who was an uncle or something. And the regent, I guess I would say he was maybe kind of a wimp because he signed a treaty saying that they would not attack Germany, that they would be passive in the relationship, that they would be a friend to all. And this is what Hitler wanted them to do. He signed that treaty, and the day it became public, there was fighting in the streets. The Serbians, where he was in Belgrade, and the Slovenians, they all erupted in anger because they did not want this treaty with the Nazis. And that's when Hitler, well, within less than 2 weeks, he attacked Belgrade. And my uncle, my husband's uncle, who was a soldier fighting for the king, was captured in skirmish that killed many, many people, and he was taken to a Nazi prison camp and held in captivity for 4 years. For 4 years in a Nazi prison camp. So I'm very anti, not Germans, but anti-Nazis and anti-communists.
How did you
just
weave
to
the story? Oh,
Yeah, so I was just going to say, just to kind of, not necessarily the sympathizing with the Nazi aspect there, but what I meant more so was, talk about the Italian side in the war. And then just having that perspective and then being able to say, look, there are people involved in this rather than they're all malicious, they're all,
Oh, yes, I don't
et cetera,
take
et
a
cetera.
broad brush and say everyone who serves under a certain person is necessarily culpable, especially the citizens who aren't battling for it. But I mean, there's always been questions about what side of the war you're on and what good or harm you're doing. Many wars are looked at that way. Certainly the Americans, though, came out as big heroes in World War II without question. Um, I wish my dad was around so you could ask him, but they were, so proud of what they had done, and they did feel like heroes when they came home, and they were treated as heroes. And when we went to visit Italy, and they knew he was an American, they would come up just to shake his hand. I mean, it was very heartening. But no, I didn't blame the Italians for being on the side of the Nazis, but I certainly blame Mussolini and the strange things that Mussolini did. Those fascist dictators, they controlled people so that this average citizen was starving. They took the food off the tables. They took the food out of the countryside so that the Italian people who are just trying to go about their business didn't have food. It was all going to the troops, and Hitler was controlling Mussolini for a very long time. People were living in the mountains trying to steal food. They were trying to escape over the mountains to get away from all of that. If you really look at what the citizens were going through, it was pretty terrible. The average soldier was probably just doing what he had to do because he was conscripted at a certain age, and it's hard to know. I do hold fault with anyone who worked in concentration camps. I can't let go of that, or they were only following orders. I'm sorry. There has to be an order that's so horrible that you, as a human being, won't follow it. But I understand what you're saying. It's not a broad brush of all those people were the enemy or something. I guess you'd have to say my father married the enemy in that case, which he wouldn't have done. He was a pro.
how did you, in a little bit of the mechanics and how you created the story? I'd love to learn, or for you really to share with our audience, how you weave this. I mean, because like I said earlier in the show, an academic paper is very structured, right? I mean, you're following facts and you're citing resources and all these sort of things. Now you're what maybe I'll even call it this free thinking to create this beautiful story. So how did you shift and then start to create this story?
Thank you for the compliment. I don't know that I could make the shift. My first line of attack was to gather all the really great books about Yugoslavia and that part of the world. So I actually have a bibliography that I put on my website, even though you wouldn't put a bibliography in a novel. And I had to have that background before I could move ahead of it. Then when I felt like I understood a little bit about the folks, I began to write just at a basic level. I took the 6 children that included my mother-in-law and, shrunk them down to kids and described the kind of house they lived in and the kind of farm they lived on and what their daily routine was like and what the surroundings of beautiful Bled, Slovenia are, which it's on a lake. It's the most gorgeous lake in the world, or nearly so. The mountains right there, the Alps, they're just below Austria. There's a lot of beauty in that part of the world, and a simplicity still that is very refreshing. Um, and when I had really gotten into it and trying to picture her house and everything about the family, I decided COVID be darned. We had to go over and see it. So my husband and I got our third booster ahead of time and went over to Slovenia and spent some time and met some of the second cousins or first cousins once removed, and some Slovenian people who had been alive during part of that time, and talked to them. And then I read some books that had been written by Slovenians about World War II and had been translated into English. And they were very blood curdling, kind of, in terms of what had happened to the soldiers coming home and what had been done to them by the partisans who were supposedly the good guys fighting to get rid of the Nazis, but the partisans had no boundaries on who was fair to kill and how you could kill them. And if they didn't have enough bullets, they would use a pitchfork. I mean, it was just you used what was at hand. It was guerrilla warfare in the mountains, not a jungle. But you've all heard a lot about the jungle warfare, so. And also, before I wrote this, which I consider an important novel, I wrote 3 horror novels. And I did those because I didn't have to have a bibliography. I just had to. Well, Stephen King was my muse, I guess. And Edgar Allan Poe, I had loved as a kid. I just loved Edgar Allan Poe. Not that I could compare myself to either of them in terms of creativity, but I wrote these horror novels about an old New England house, and we had lived in 2 old New England houses, rehabbed them, and one of them had had a gravestone in the backyard with a child's name on it and date of birth and a little poem about the child. And I'd be doing things around the yard and I'd think, how did he die? Is he in my basement? Where is this boy? What's going on here? And I would let my mind go. But I never did anything about it. And it was years later that I decided to write my first horror novel. And I mention this now because, in my opinion, you can't go from being a staid sort of historian, psychologist, health professional, and write about war unless you've looked at horror. Because I think war and horror are very related. Not that it's mystical and all of that stuff that we associate with horror coming from the unknown, but the fear, the things that human beings do to each other, all of that, I had to get kind of out there before I could go on and be a serious writer.
That's such a great point too. I think it's brushed over very easily that war is horror. I mean, because of that fear that you live with in those situations.
What you witness, you have to ignore to continue.
Yeah.
The losses. And of course, we know so many people come back with PTSD for a reason. I mean, it wasn't a little squish of a dog in the street that upset them. Yeah.
Mm-mm. Yeah. That's a powerful way to think about it also. And I'm going to ask this, but you may not be able to answer it or not want to, because I always love doing that, because now you're like, oh my God, what's he going to ask?
I didn't think this was a sex show. So. Other than that, you can ask anything.
Now I'm turning red. Oh my
sorry.
You got me good. Now I got to think of what the heck I was going to ask. No, I would love if you can do this without giving away, spoiler alert sort of thing of the book. What is the lesson that you want the reader to gain when they read that book?
I can't answer that. I think I just, but I don't know
Okay.
that this isn't such wishful thinking that I'll sound like I'm in fantasy land. But I wish there would be no more war. I wish there would be no more war. The horror, the heartbreak, the loss of life, the loss of identity, the loss of family. I mean, the losses that my mother, to some extent, and my mother-in-law completely, they lost everything they'd grown up with, and years of their lives were just torn apart, and they couldn't count on much of anything for a long, long time. And that's the people who came out on the good side. Um, if you think about the atrocities, we've all said that could never happen again, but it happens in different ways in different places, and we just don't always recognize it as such. Right.
Or admit to it. I would also say that, also
Yeah,
having seen some of those
I bet you
things.
have.
So I want to. Well, I'm going to pause because mine's a leap ahead. So Camden, you had something I could tell. So I'm going to pause with mine because it's a different format. Not as bad as what you thought it was going to be.
That's not necessarily bad. I just wouldn't answer a question right now.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm a psychologist, remember.
Oh no. So my question.
That's true.
No, my question was more in, speaking of the historical fiction, I think that, Dad, you kind of alluded to this early on, like the jump from academia to historical fiction might not make sense to some people, but my thought with it was that it's an accessibility thing. Dad, we've talked about it before of the example that we use all the time is Stephen Dubner with Freakonomics. It takes this super dry, boring thing of economics and makes it accessible to all these people that even though he's not necessarily researching, he's giving the research to people in a way that is more accessible. And that's kind of what I was thinking with historical fiction. Because you could paint a picture going through, a history textbook. I've, Dad, I think on the last failed recording, we were talking about Lewis and Clark. Like, I remember reading Undaunted Courage. There's some amazing stuff in there. But I wouldn't have read Undaunted Courage if I hadn't read the historical fiction about their dog that they had with them during their journey. You know what I mean? Like, that's what got me in the first place. Was that accessibility part of your motivation for telling that story?
Camden, you are a genius. I'm serious. That is a very honest and important comment you're making, because when I was younger, I didn't like history. It was boring. When I had to read history books about World War II as an 18-year-old, I could care less. I mean, I cared, but it was so dry, and then they attacked here and they attacked there, and Eisenhower did this, and I had very little interest. But as an older person, I love history because I'm about to be history, and I loved reading about it to understand what all that had meant. And then when I was writing the book, I was thinking, if I was a historical teacher or a history teacher in college, I would assign a book like this, because the kids would read it and they would want to know a little bit more about quite a few things that happen in the book. The history would be there. They would know a little bit about the shuffle that went on between the Allies and the communists coming into the Allied group, and how that resulted in things being handed over to communists that shouldn't have been. They would remember the names of some of these leaders who did some wonderful things and then some not so wonderful things. They were very human. But I think a book like this does make history accessible. And if you are interested in Eastern Europe and if you are interested in World War II or teaching that, you could augment what you are teaching with a few novels that handle it well, because the history is accurate in my book. If it isn't, somebody has to tell me quickly. I've had it read by many people who could, on both sides of the ocean. And I put a section in there towards the very end, a chapter that says, this is what I know to be true, and these are the things that I had to make up because I couldn't know how they behaved in this and this and this situation. And I needed to say something about what happened to the Jewish community. And it wasn't first person in our family, but it was something I could tie us into in a way that would be fair and square. And I wanted to own how that wasn't us, but who it might have been. And things like that, bringing in the history of the culture of the Slovenians with Maria Theresa having a church on the island in Bled and what that had meant, and how Catholic my mother-in-law's family was, and how Catholicism also plays a part in the problems that arise during that war.
This episode of the Cam Otis Show. If you're enjoying this conversation, then make sure to share it with other lifelong learners in your life. Stay up to date with the show on Facebook and Instagram at Cam Otis Show, and subscribe to our channel on YouTube so you're the first to hear about new episodes and other special content. Now let's get back to the show.
You were very good. It was a good question.
I want to. Well, and I want to agree with you too, because having done a lot of work in that part of the world, the story is so important. And the family story. I don't know how many times, of course, at this point, I can't remember any of them for anything. But I heard those family stories. Sitting around drinking a cup of coffee or a beer with my neighbors.
Did you mean McGregor stories or the families of Europe, other parts of Europe? Yeah,
the families in Europe. So when I was doing work in
you did
in
work
former
there.
Yugoslavia in
you did?
Bosnia, Serbia, Macedonia, Kosovo. Yes, I sat there and I listened to these stories, and I heard how their family, various stories, and what I think is I think the point I'd like to make here is the fact that you hit the nail on the head. If you're going to do anything in that part of the world, read this book, because the story, you could read the history and the facts and know the date that this happened and the date that happened. And that's all very important to each of those families, because we joke here in the U.S. We joke about the Hatfields and McCoys, right? Well, Hatfields and McCoys ain't got nothing on what's happened over there in that part of the world.
The Serbs and the Croatians
and they remember that they're I mean, how they remember that their great grandfather had his land stolen by that guy's great grandmother's uncle or something. Just this crazy stuff. For as an American, we're like, dude, what? Why do you even care? But it's because,
and we're over here as McGregor's dad eating Campbell's chicken noodle soup, even though the Campbells are the one who killed Rob Roy. That's only 150, 200 years ago. Come on. Longer than that. Sorry, I messed up on that. Yeah, 300 something, but still.
No, I get it. I get it. Real people, real stories, and part of the reason my book is important, in my opinion, is that some of these stories, which are true, have not been let out because Tito kept such a tight rein on what information was allowed out. When the murders were beginning to come to light that had occurred under the communist right at the end of the war, the communists who were in charge, including Tito until 1980, would not allow it to be looked at. And the people who could have revealed what they had witnessed were frightened, and they didn't talk about it. And then up to and through 1990, the communists were still in charge. And even now, there's that socialistic sympathy in much of the government. They don't want to put any money into identifying the bones that are being turned up. I mean, people are always going to say missing in the war until they know that something has been found, and they're not going to identify these bodies that were blown up in mines and everything else to just get rid of them. But we're talking probably 150,000 people in a small country were murdered. And those are just a few Slovenians who dare to write about it. And that won't be in any history book because it was denied. History is in the hands of the writer. History is who's holding the pen and what's hanging over that person's head, perhaps. So over here, safe in Connecticut, I didn't know to be afraid.
You and I've got an insider nugget. You and I were exchanging some
Oh yeah.
some messages earlier today, and you said something about how you allow the characters to
Yes.
tell the story. Which tell us what that's like, because I imagine just like an actor does, you become that character.
You
What
lose
is that
yourself
like?
in what you're writing. You become very attached to your characters and immersed in them. And it's like speaking in another language where you don't translate to English in your head. You're just going with it, which I can't do, but I understand it. Um, the the character does have a life of his and her own, and sometimes I discovered it first in the horror books. I would get my people into a terrible dilemma, and I wanted them to get out of it, but I didn't know how they'd get out of it. And I'd have to stop writing for a few days, and I'd be doing other things and ruminating on it, or even in the night. And I'd wake up in the morning and I'd finally have an answer. And the character was pushing me to say, this is how we've got to go. And Stephen King even has said that. And, he's been asked a million times how he writes so many books. And he's written books for writers. So I read one of them. And he says, you let the character tell you what's going to happen. And that happens. If you're really into your characters, you can't sit down with an outline. I think it'd be the worst book you could write if you're following a strict outline, unless it's a specific, well-constructed detective tale, maybe. But if it's about human beings, you have to describe their characters so well, their personalities, their physical presence, the kind of things they believed and would say, so well that you feel a part of them. And I actually mourned when somebody died in one of my scenes. I really didn't want to kill him off. I did not want him to die, but it was required. And I felt terrible for several days. It hung over me like, could I fix that? Could I change that? But I know it may sound a little wacky. I mean, I came around, but that's how deeply I was involved, I guess.
Well, then how do you put it to bed?
You just keep,
That's, if you're so involved with that character and you're so in love with them, and they're telling the story, and unless everybody dies,
Oh,
how do you
well,
put
I mean,
the
at the
story to
end,
bed?
I usually have a surprise of some sort. A surprise that will make the reader happy that they got there, but a surprise that's not out of line with the characters and what would be necessary. So people die, but people live. And those who live carry on in a certain way, and it may honor someone who's died, or it may show a certain respect to that situation. Each story is a little different. In the horror novels, it's easier because you can die more than once. You can come back in the second version or the third edition, the trilogy. That which is what I did. But in a true story, you have to know when enough is enough. If you've had a pet and you've had to put them down, it's heartbreaking, gut-wrenching, but you do it because you
Mm.
love them and it's time. And I guess that's how I rationalize what I have to do to a character. If it's going to ruin the rest of the story or make it false and hollow, then I've got to do what I've got to do.
Does that provide and actually, I guess you might already have this from the psychology background, but what I would think is going through that writing process like that, letting the character tell their story, is that would kind of provide a little bit of an eye-opening look into other people's lives. I think, I don't know the exact phrase, Dad, but I think Marcus Aurelius says something along the lines of when somebody shows you who they are, believe them. They're all just being people. Let them be people. Don't try to force your judgments on them. And that's kind of what I think when you're talking about letting the character tell the story, is it's not you forcing your judgments onto that character. It's kind of letting them live their life. So did you get that kind of a perspective? Did that change the way, you're seeing the person cutting you off in traffic?
Well, I helped create them on paper. I'm the one who described them and did all that. So there's a part of me in every one of them, I guess. I can't eliminate it, but I can focus on the bad sides in one character and the more honorable sides in another. I think for me what it is I like to get lost in them. I don't do drugs. I don't drink anymore. I for health reasons, of course, but it's like a drug because you just get totally absorbed in what you're doing, and I can concentrate so hard that my grandchildren can run by, my dog can jump on. I hardly know what's out there. I can get up and stir the spaghetti sauce and then come back and finish the sentence if I think it's going to burn. But I'm trying to say that, well, I hope so. I hope so. Because my first book was actually a little Italian memoir about her. But anyway, this is just to say that it's all enthralling. If you're going to really do a character well, you just have to let yourself be part of them and them part of you, and then do all you can to make them different from you and different from the other characters too. And sometimes you definitely need evil.
Yeah. Well, yeah. You need evil so you can
the
see what good is,
contrast.
right? I don't remember who said that. So I'm just kind of piecing this together because I'm still in this hardcore academic and beautiful novelist, right? Not that you weren't beautiful as an academic, but I do have to say, was this drive, this storytelling always there, or was it maybe a change in the season of life? You know what I mean? Where sometimes we kind of go through this change in our life.
It was a change to dedicate myself to a project that I just wanted to do, rather than what was going to be published and get me points for promotion and tenure, and keep the academic community reasonably happy with me and be good for my students and all of that. These were kind of what did I want to do. But I grew up, my daddy would tell me a little story that he made up every night at bedtime rather than reading after a certain point. He would make it up. And then in the first grade, if we had a recess that was so rainy and snowy and icy in Manchester, New Hampshire, that I couldn't go outside, the teacher would, have little games for us, or after a little while, they'd say, "Cindy, would you like to tell a story?" And I'd stand up, and I would use some of the same characters my father had used, but I would spin my own little tale about Ricky Raccoon and animals in the woods. And, it was before I'd ever seen Bambi, but it was Bambi-ish, not, of course, at Disney quality. But I could tell a story and have fun with it. And then in high school, where there was a student magazine, I published nothing great, but little stories, little vignettes often very humorous because that's in me, if you could tell. Um, and, I really wanted to try something more than a textbook, which was very formula driven and accurate. But, and so it was finally, I think, to be honest, the pandemic set me free in that sense because I didn't want to go out and catch COVID. And I needed a project I could do at home, and my artwork isn't anything special, and I can't sing. And there were a lot of things, but I knew how to write and I wanted to do it. Is that too boring an answer?
Did, No, it's a good answer. And
No.
the thing that it opens up for me that I'm curious about is and not necessarily literal pushback, but maybe just in a social way of going from academia to writing novels. I can picture that in a sense of, whether it's just you should be putting that effort in elsewhere. It's like, why are you wasting your time on that? Or maybe even the hierarchy of arts or the hierarchy of studying, that it's like, oh, that's down here, but we're up here type of a thing. Did you experience any of that? Or did the pandemic shield you from
Well, actually, it was almost the opposite. You say you're an author and people go, "Oh, an author." And it's, around here, because I live in an academic community, being a professor is not necessarily a big deal. Having a PhD, everybody has a PhD in this town, it's true. It's that kind of a community. But when somebody says you're an author, they say it with a little awe. Like, it's not like I've been on Oprah or anything. It's just, although here I am on the Otis and Camden show. That's I'm getting up there.
That's right.
One step away,
One step
or
away.
maybe exceeded that hope. But in my community, people think it's great to be an author. I've done book signings in the community. I've done book signings with the veterans. I've done book signings for the Hungarians. I'm doing some of the ladies' clubs that read books. I'm doing a big event for them in April. It's fun. I'm a minor celebrity in a small town, and people want to guess about where my horror novels are set because this is New England. Maybe they know the house. Is it this house? Is it that house, Cindy? I'm not telling.
I could picture that. I could picture somebody trying to woo you with a little cup of coffee, maybe.
Tea.
So it was this house,
Cookies.
right? It was this one?
Well, there's a picture of the house. Go ahead.
So one other piece. The other piece that I was really curious about as I was preparing for the episode is we talk a lot about storytelling and like the marketing and the business sense. And there's something that people say, I never really hear this much in marketing, but they talk about it for movies and that type of thing. That in order to tell a good story, you should tell someone where you're taking them and then just make the path different than they were expecting. Would you agree with that assessment of how to make a good story, or feel free to just go from there, use that as a launching point? I just want to hear your thoughts.
I think with the horror books, it was good to surprise them a lot. So you're going down one path, and then the path either explodes or something big changes, and hopefully it's not totally predictable. That's so boring when it's totally predictable. With this book, with the red toque or toque, either one is correct, I was trying to tell an accurate story, as accurate as I could about those times and really live the history, but bring out the things that had not been said about, that were surprises that you might not have thought about, that happened in the culture, or even the country Slovenia. There are so many people who have never heard of it, and it is tiny, but it is absolutely gorgeous. It's a gem, and the people all speak English. They're very friendly. I mean, it was the most comfortable trip we'd ever had. I've been to Italy a bunch of times, but it's much more formal. The much more city life, much more hectic. This was just so pretty and nice. And now I've just made a contract on, I guess it was last Monday, to have the book translated into Slovenian, because the people who need to read it aren't, necessarily they speak English, but they may not read a book in English. And I've been written about in a big newspaper in Belgrade, but the people want the book and it's in English, not Serbian. So it won't be in Serbian, but at least it will be in Slovenian to begin with, and then we'll take it from there. But I wanted to do that.
That's awesome. Which leads me to what's next? What is there another story that's itching at you, or we'll wait until you stub your toe and find out about something else?
A friend of mine has just told me a story that's true of her family, and I listen to everybody. They have a story. I want to hear the ideas, but this one would be very controversial. It's the story of maybe somebody who was let out of jail too soon, and it looks like a good thing that he's let out, and then what he does is not good, absolutely not good. And so I think if I can do it, I want to tell both sides of the rescue of a young man and then the destruction that he causes, and put that together in a way that will have social value. It won't be a novel, but I will have to novelize a lot of it. And I'm also afraid that somebody might shoot me after this one, so I don't know. But you know what I mean? It's risky. It's risky to put some ideas out there that may not be there's always going to be somebody who doesn't like what you say. And anyway, I'm not sure I'll do that, or I might do a cookbook. That'd be a lot safer.
I was going to say that's not too different than what we've been talking about, though. The only difference is that's controversial now versus controversial.
Yeah,
80
well,
years
yeah.
ago.
I wasn't around when it happened, and those people who were doing the murders aren't around now. But this is current, current times. I'd tell you more off camera, but I don't want to get it out there,
I'll just say this, that if Miss Jessica's in the other room listening, you've got your first reader sitting by.
She's interested.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
This could be the modern, what's the classic? Is it In Cold Blood? Is that the one where he goes in and follows the serial killer, falls in love? I don't know if that's actually how close that is to it.
Well,
the story, but that's what made me
I
think
would
about
have to do some traveling and some investigation, but I don't know yet how brave I'll be, and I can't run as fast anymore. How about you, Otis? You still fast?
Just never get out of the car.
No, huh? No.
No.
Old bones.
Oh, goodness, no.
Yeah.
That's right. But I just have to be faster than the person
I'm
next
not
to me.
sure
That's
about
all I
that.
gotta be.
For me.
Yeah, well, I tell you what, you said something that I thought that leapt out at me as something I learned, because as you would guess, I'm very structured, and the way I do things. And I kind of, in my book and in my next book, I've already kind of, when I wrote my first book, I did the outline and filled in the blanks. In my next book, I'm already doing the same thing. But just the fact that you said that in a novel, if you do that, you lose it, because then the characters aren't telling the story. And what a different way of thinking about telling a story, as opposed to the very structured outline, got to follow this pattern, you got to do this. Let the characters tell it. And there's a lot of inner meaning to that. And I appreciate learning that. So, Camden, how about you? What did you learn?
Are we gonna have to co-author a leadership novel about somebody who goes through and gets the burden of leadership along the way? They learn about storming and forming and norming and all these different leadership things.
There you go.
Is that the book, Dad?
That's it. The hero's journey, man. That's the hero's journey.
Exactly. What I learned, Cindy, you said this, and Dad, you laughed at it knowingly, which was the about to be history. It's like, I know it was a joke, but it's such an interesting piece of, we talk about the reason as people get older, they get that perspective where they're more interested in history. As you live through more history, all of a sudden it becomes more and more interesting, right? When you're young and all these things are brand new and happening all the time, it doesn't have that same weight, right? You got too much going on in front of you. But I just thought it was a really interesting thing about, becoming a part of history and thinking about that perspective as a good reason to read more history.
There you go.
Yeah,
or
yeah.
you're doomed to repeat it. Cindy, how about you? What did you learn?
I don't know that I learned, but I have a sense of you two as just wonderful men, and the warmth you displayed here made it so easy to have fun on the show. And then the insights that you pulled out that I didn't even know I had done what Camden described in terms of, setting it up so that people would learn history in a more palatable way. I had written about that, trying to market the book to some academics, but I hadn't thought of it as a real takeaway. And I just appreciated being here so much. I hope that isn't a cop-out, but I really, really loved it. Okay.
No, we don't keep score, believe me. So, Cindy, how do folks find you, follow you?
Buy my book.
Buy your book.
Let me hold it up.
Those
Can you see it?
Please.
Which way?
Move it over to your right. To your right.
Oh, that's your left.
Okay.
A little more.
Keep going.
The red tube.
There
Love
you
and
go.
Loss
Perfect.
in the Time of Tito.
Look at that.
Amazon has this book, and every paperback that's purchased, I make a nice donation to Wounded Warriors, because that's how I'm paying back what the uncle went through, and using his story. And I feel much better about myself that I'm doing that with most of the profit. The other way to get it is my website. It's www.getbooksbycindy.com. It's very simple. Getbooksbycindy.com, and all of my books show up. And there's a link on there. You hit the button that says buy this book, and they take you right to Amazon. And then you do business with Amazon as you usually would. But sometimes when you go into Amazon, you can't find the book you want so easily. So you can get it right off my website.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I got to ask before we wrap completely, Dad. Cindy, were those pictures on the front,
All
were
of
any of those
them.
family pictures?
In fact, well, I wish you could see it.
Oh, I love that. I knew it.
You have a lot of insight there, boy. This is the, oops, I can't do it. That's the beautiful bride who waited so long, and the man who disappeared, and her little girl in their wedding picture. And then, I don't know if you can see it. There's a couple over here down here. Where am I? Anyway, there's a couple with a baby in their arms that you're seeing. That baby is my husband.
Mm-hmm.
That baby is my husband. So, yeah, it's amazing.
That's
amazing.
Cool.
That's amazing.
Love it.
Anyway.
That's awesome.
Oh,
Cindy,
thank you.
Thank you so much for your time and
it was a pleasure.
And hanging out with us.
I hope
today.
to talk
really
to you again. Take care. Bye-bye.
Oh, yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Camden, run us out.
All right. Thank you all for listening to the Cam Otis Show, and a special thanks to our guest, Cynthia Adams, for joining us today. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to pass along to someone else so they can enjoy it too. Make sure to follow the Cam Otis Show on Facebook and Instagram, and you can watch full videos of the show on our YouTube page. And while you're there, make sure you hit that subscribe button too. As always, the full archive of our episodes is available at www.camandotisshow.com. Thanks again, and we'll see you all next time.
Bye-bye.